It was a cold October evening when Mara first heard the knocking. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, spaced evenly, too intentional to be the wind. Her old farmhouse sat at the edge of town, where the trees grew thick and the gravel road disappeared into mist after sundown. She'd just settled into bed with a cup of tea, the faint hum of her space heater filling the silence, when the sound came again. This time softer, almost polite. She told herself it was probably a branch, maybe an animal. But her body tensed anyway, every hair rising as though her instincts knew something she didn't. She grabbed her phone. No signal. Not unusual for her patch of rural Maine, but inconvenient when you lived alone. The only light came from her nightstand lamp, casting weak yellow across her room and catching the framed photos on her wall. Her parents, gone for years. Her ex, long out of the picture. And her dog Daisy, who'd passed the winter before. Loneliness had a way of warping the mind at night, she told herself. Still, she found her gaze drifting toward the window. The curtains swayed faintly, as though stirred by breath rather than breeze. The third knock was louder. And closer. This time, it didn't come from the door, but from the window itself, the one right beside her bed. Mara froze, the ceramic mug trembling in her hand. Her heart drummed against her ribs, echoing the rhythm of the knocks. She didn't want to look, but not looking felt worse. She turned her head slowly, expecting maybe a trick of light, a shadow of the trees outside. What she saw instead was the faint outline of a face. Pale, pressed against the glass, features blurred by condensation. And it was smiling. Mara stumbled out of bed, knocking over her tea. Scalding liquid spread across the floor as she backed toward the door, her breath shallow and uneven. She fumbled for the baseball bat she kept by the dresser. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice thinner than she meant it to be. No answer, just the soft fog of breath forming against the window pane, then disappearing, then forming again. She darted to the light switch. The bulb flickered once, twice, then died. The room was swallowed by dark. Outside, something moved, slow, scraping, circling the house. When she finally gathered the courage to peer through the front door's peephole, the porch was empty. The night was still. The woods were silent. But on the window by her bed, the one where the face had been, she found something that made her blood run cold. A handprint. Small, too small to belong to an adult. And underneath, drawn crudely in the fog, was a single word, H.I. That night, Mara didn't sleep. She sat up with every light on, gripping her bat until sunrise. What she didn't know then was that this was only the first night, the beginning of something that had been waiting for years to be seen. Mara tried to convince herself that what she'd seen, that face at the window, had been a trick of exhaustion, a collision of loneliness and half-dreaming fear. She told herself that as she scrubbed the glass clean the next morning, though her hands shook with every wipe. The tiny handprint was real. She could still see the faint smudge of it under the sunlight, as though whatever made it had pressed with something more than skin, something oily, almost inky, that refused to fade completely. She left the last streak untouched. Somehow, erasing it felt like inviting it back. The day passed uneventfully. She spent it repairing fences, making calls for work, trying to fill the air with normalcy. Yet every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the old house, the whisper of the wind through the chimney. When dusk fell, the quiet settled again, thick and uneasy. That night, she left every light on. She kept the curtains closed. But as she sat on the couch with her laptop, she began to notice something strange. The reflection in the black screen behind her didn't quite match her movements. When she turned her head, the reflection lagged, just a fraction of a second, like something else was watching from behind the glass. The first whisper came around midnight. Faint, almost delicate, like someone exhaling words right beside her ear. "Mara." She spun around, heart leaping. The hallway behind her stretched long and narrow, lit by a single bulb at the far end. Nothing there. But the air felt colder, heavier. She stepped forward, each footfall echoing louder than it should have. The house seemed to breathe around her, old wood shifting, floorboards popping in patterns that almost mimicked footsteps. "It's the pipes," she whispered to herself. "Just the pipes." But pipes didn't call your name. Dash for halfway down the hall, she saw it. A faint figure, standing at the very end. It was small, childlike, its head tilted to one side. The light above flickered as she froze in place. She blinked, and the figure was gone. But the whisper came again, this time from behind her. I missed you. Mara turned so fast she nearly fell. Her breath fogged in front of her face, though the heater still hummed. The temperature had dropped suddenly, unnaturally. The smell in the air shifted, wet earth, old wood, something faintly metallic. She backed into her bedroom and slammed the door, pressing her weight against it as if expecting something to push back. The rest of the night passed in fragments, flashes of half-sleep and stifled panic. At one point, she thought she heard light footsteps padding across the hallway outside her room, then a soft scratching at her door. She didn't move, not even when the scratching turned into a rhythmic tapping, perfectly mimicking the same 3 knocks from the night before. When the morning came, the house was silent again. But when Mara opened her door, she found something lying on the floor, a tiny footprint, muddy and bare, leading away down the hall. She followed it only as far as the stairs before stopping. The prints didn't lead outside. They led down, into the cellar. Mara stood at the top of the cellar stairs, flashlight in hand, heart hammering like a trapped bird. The morning light spilling through the kitchen windows barely reached the first few steps. Beyond that was only black. The air that rose from below was damp and cold, laced with the smell of earth and rust. She told herself she just needed to check, that maybe an animal had gotten in and left the muddy prints. But the logic was thin, and she knew it. The footprints were too perfect, too deliberate. Small, yes, but shaped like a person's, not a creature's. Paragraph 2. She descended slowly, the beam of her flashlight trembling across the rough stone walls. Cobwebs brushed her face. Water dripped somewhere deeper in the dark, echoing like slow, measured footsteps. When her boots hit the packed dirt floor, she paused, listening. The cellar had always been unnerving. Her father used to store old tools down there, and even as a child she'd hated the way sound seemed to vanish into its corners. Now, the silence pressed against her ears until she thought she could hear her own pulse. Then, a creak. From the far end, behind the old shelves, her light caught movement, quick, darting. She swung the beam toward it, illuminating a cluster of broken jars and dusty boxes. "Hello," she called, hating the quiver in her voice. A faint giggle answered her, distant and breathy, coming from somewhere low to the ground. The sound was unmistakably a child's. Mara felt her throat tighten. "Who's down here?" she demanded, forcing the words out louder. The giggle stopped. The air went still again, and that was somehow worse. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her flashlight circling slowly until it landed on something pale near the floorboards. At first, she thought it was a doll. Small, porcelain-faced, one glass eye missing. But as she knelt, she realized the doll was wrong. Its skin wasn't porcelain. It was paper-thin, cracked in places like dried clay, but textured, almost human. The clothes on it were rotted, but familiar. A faded blue dress she hadn't seen since she was 10. Her chest tightened. That dress had belonged to her sister. The sister who had disappeared one summer evening, decades ago, while they'd been playing hide and seek near the woods. Her parents never spoke of it again. They'd moved on. But Mara never had. She stumbled backward, flashlight shaking violently now. Her mind raced. No, it can't be. It can't. The shadows seemed to pulse with movement, whispering around her. And then she heard it again. That same small voice, right behind her ear. "You found me." Mara dropped the flashlight. It spun on the ground, beam flaring wildly across the walls. For one brief second, she saw something standing in the corner, small, pale, its head tilted, that same faint smile from the window. But its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow light. When she screamed, the cellar light overhead flickered on by itself, and the thing was gone. Only the dusty blue dress lay in the dirt, folded neatly, as though someone had been waiting for her to find it. Mara didn't remember running up the cellar steps, only the sound of her boots pounding against wood, her own breathing ragged and wild. When she finally slammed the door shut, she leaned against it, shaking, listening for any sound from below. Silence. But even that silence felt wrong, like the quiet after a scream. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window should have felt reassuring, but the warmth didn't reach her. The house itself seemed colder now. She locked the cellar door and pushed a heavy chair against it. Even though she knew, somehow, that a lock wouldn't matter for the rest of the day, Mara tried to pretend nothing had happened. She went about her chores, played music loud enough to fill the house. But every now and then, when she turned the volume down, she thought she heard faint tapping from under the floor. Soft at first, then more insistent. Tap, 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 always in groups of three, the same rhythm as the knocking from that first night. She'd stop what she was doing, strain her ears, but as soon as she focused on it, the noise would vanish. Only when she moved again would it start up once more, as if following her footsteps. By evening, she couldn't stand it. She crouched down and pressed her ear to the hardwood floor of the living room. At first, there was nothing but her heartbeat. Then, from deep below, the unmistakable sound of whispering. Dozens of voices, murmuring together, too low to make out words. Her breath caught. They sounded like they were right under her, their tones strangely rhythmic, almost like they were chanting. Then one voice, clearer, closer, broke through the others. You found her. Mara leapt back, knocking over a lamp. The whispers stopped instantly. The only sound left was the bulb rolling across the floor, clicking softly as it cooled. That night, the voices returned in her dreams. She saw flashes, the cellar, the little blue dress, a girl standing barefoot in the dirt. The girl's eyes were black voids, but her smile was the same one Mara remembered from her childhood, gentle, innocent. Come play, the girl said. When Mara woke, her pillow was damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. And something else, faint streaks of dirt on her sheets, shaped like small, dusty footprints. She sat up, every nerve in her body screaming. The faint tapping started again, right under her bed. Tap, tap, tap. Dawn. Mara was a hollow version of herself. She sat on the floor beside her bed, gripping her bat, staring at the floorboards that separated her from the whispers beneath. When the first light of morning hit the wall, she noticed something new. Faint cracks had appeared in the wood, running in thin, jagged lines across the boards. As she leaned closer, she realized they weren't cracks at all. They were letters, carved into the wood, in tiny, uneven handwriting, were the words, "Let her out." Mara stumbled backward, gasping. From somewhere below, faint laughter rose again, the laughter of a little girl who'd been waiting far too long. Mara couldn't look away from the carved words. Let her out. They seemed to shimmer faintly in the early light, as though the grooves were still fresh, still bleeding. Her mind spun with questions she didn't want answers to. Who carved them? When? And how? When she hadn't heard a thing all night. The air in the bedroom felt heavy, the kind of thick, suffocating quiet that presses against the skin. She told herself she would leave, pack a bag, get in her truck, drive anywhere. But something deep in her gut whispered that the house wouldn't let her go. Not yet. She spent the morning pacing the kitchen, watching the cellar door as if expecting it to open on its own. The scratching and tapping had stopped, but silence didn't comfort her anymore. It only made her more aware of the waiting. By afternoon, she'd made a decision she hated herself for. She was going to pull up the floorboards. Not to let her out, whatever that meant, but to prove to herself there was nothing there. To reclaim her sanity. She found her father's old crowbar in the shed, its metal rusted and cold to the touch. As she carried it back inside, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Muddy child-sized footprints leading from the cellar door to her bedroom. She followed the prints with shaking hands, tracing their path across the creaking hallway. They stopped at the foot of her bed, and at their end lay something folded neatly on the floor. The blue dress, the same one she'd left downstairs in the cellar. Now it was clean, pressed, the fabric soft and new, as though it had never been buried in dust. A small ribbon tied at the collar fluttered as if stirred by breath. Mara stumbled backward, her eyes stinging. No, she whispered. No, no, no. But the smell that filled the room told her this was real. That faint, familiar mix of lilac soap and damp earth. Her sister's scent. She didn't remember prying up the first board, only the sharp crack of wood splitting and the wave of rot that rushed up from beneath. The hole was small at first, revealing only darkness and a faint shimmer of moisture. Then she pulled up another, and another, until the gap widened enough to see something pale below. Her flashlight's beam trembled over the shape, a small hand, delicate and gray, resting in the dirt. It wasn't skeletal. It looked recent, preserved. The fingers twitched. Mara screamed and fell backward, dropping the light. When she scrambled to grab it again, the hand was gone. The whisper rose again, but this time it was inside her head, soft, pleading. You promised you wouldn't leave me. The temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in clouds. And then, from beneath the hole, the blue dress began to rise. Slowly, impossibly, as if lifted by invisible hands. The fabric floated up until it hovered at eye level, sleeves gently swaying, as though someone unseen were standing inside it. Mara could only watch, frozen, as the dress turned toward her, and in the faint hollow where a face should be, two small black eyes blinked open. Play with me, the voice said. And the floor beneath Mara's feet gave way. Mara woke on the floor, her head throbbing. For a long moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The air felt heavy, damp, filled with that same earthy smell from beneath the boards. She sat up slowly, her body aching. The bedroom looked the same, and yet not. The morning light coming through the curtains was wrong. Too dim, as if filtered through water. Dust hung motionless in the air, refusing to fall. When she glanced toward the floor, the hole was gone. The boards were sealed, whole again. No cracks, no letters, no sign they'd ever been pried open. Only a faint blue ribbon lying where the gap had been. She stumbled to her feet and called out, "Hello." Her voice sounded swallowed by the air, muffled. The house didn't echo anymore. It seemed to listen. She tried the bedroom door, but it resisted, not locked, just stuck, as though the wood had swollen. After a few shoves, it gave way with a groan, and she stepped into the hallway. The wallpaper looked older, yellowed and peeling in new places, as if years had passed overnight. And the air was colder. Her breath misted as she moved toward the stairs. From somewhere distant, faint laughter echoed, drifting through the halls. It was a child's laugh. She found herself standing in the living room, though she didn't remember crossing the hall. The pictures on the wall had changed. Where there had once been family photos, her parents, her dog, there were now images she didn't recognize. A little girl in a blue dress, standing in front of the farmhouse. In one picture, the girl held a small wooden doll. In another, she stood beside someone, Mara herself, but younger, her hair shorter, her eyes brighter. Her throat tightened as she lifted the frame. Her hands trembled. On the back, written in her mother's neat handwriting, were the words, "Summer, 1997, the last day they played together." A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned sharply. The hallway was empty, but the light had changed again. The once yellow glow was now dim blue, like twilight seeping through water. The air pressed against her chest, thick with the scent of lilac and soil. Then she noticed it, faint handprints appearing on the walls, one after another, as though someone invisible were running their palms along the plaster. "Stop it," Mara whispered. "Please, stop." A soft voice answered from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You forgot me." Her stomach twisted. "No," she said. "No, I didn't forget. You were gone." The voice was closer now. "You hid me." The house began to move, not shake, but shift. The floorboards beneath her feet rose and fell like breathing lungs. Doors stretched taller. The ceiling seemed to bow inward, and the sound of a heartbeat, slow, thunderous, filled the air. The photographs slid from the walls one by one, shattering across the floor. And there, amid the broken glass, Mara saw a reflection that wasn't her own. The little girl stood behind her, head tilted, that same smile soft and wrong. "It's okay," the girl said, voice both childlike and ancient. "I remember too." Then the lights flickered, and the entire house exhaled. Mara stood in the living room for a long time, barely breathing. When the house finally fell still again, she noticed something she hadn't before. The hallway, the one that should have led back toward the kitchen, looked wrong. Longer. The wallpaper pattern repeated unevenly, and at the far end where there had always been a blank wall, there was now a door. Old, heavy wood, painted the same dull green as the trim. She was sure it hadn't been there when she'd first moved in. She'd cleaned every inch of this house. She would have remembered a door like that. But now it waited for her, slightly ajar, breathing a faint draft of cold air that smelled of the cellar. She told herself she wouldn't go near it. She told herself to leave, to run. But her feet didn't listen. Each step forward felt guided by something unseen, like her body was being pulled by a memory she couldn't recall. The closer she got, the colder it became. Her breath came out in plumes, her fingertips numb around the flashlight she'd found on the floor. The light flickered the moment she reached for the handle. It was carved with small initials, M and L, crudely scratched into the wood. Mara's stomach twisted. Her name. And her sister's. The door creaked open with a sigh. Inside, the room was small, far too small to fit inside the walls of the house as she knew it. The air was thick with dust, yet everything inside looked untouched by time. A little iron bed sat beneath the window, covered with a quilt Mara hadn't seen since she was a child, one her mother had sewn from scraps of their old clothes. On a wooden shelf rested a collection of small toys, a wooden horse, a ragged doll, a row of marbles. Everything was exactly as it had been in her sister's room. But that room had burned with the old farmhouse years ago. This couldn't exist. Her flashlight dimmed again, sputtering, as if the air itself drained the batteries. She stepped closer to the bed and saw a shape beneath the quilt, small, still. Her throat locked. Slowly, she lifted the corner of the blanket. Beneath it was the blue dress, neatly folded again, but this time it was damp. Cold. It smelled of river water. Something dripped from the hem and pooled onto the floor, dark, thick, almost black. As she watched, a single small hand slid out from under the dress, limp but moving just enough to curl its fingers toward hers. Mara staggered backward. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The answer came from every direction at once. "To remember what you did." The floor trembled. The walls began to weep, streaks of dark moisture running down the peeling wallpaper like tears. The small bed rattled. The toys on the shelf rolled to the floor, clattering one by one until only the ragged doll remained, sitting upright, staring at her with mismatched buttons for eyes. The air swelled with pressure, a low hum filling her ears until she thought her skull would split. Then the door behind her slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. She screamed, hammering against it, but it wouldn't open. Behind her, the small voice spoke again, closer now, right beside her ear. "Don't you remember the river, Mara?" The air around Mara shimmered like heat haze, though the room was freezing. The voice, her sister's voice, echoed through the dark, overlapping itself, coming from everywhere at once. "Don't you remember the river, Mara?" The words pressed into her skull like nails. She shut her eyes, gripping her head, whispering, "No, no, I don't." But the house had already decided for her. The smell of the river filled the room, moss, mud, iron. The cold seeped into her skin until her breath turned to mist. And when she opened her eyes again, the room was gone. The walls had melted away. She was standing by the riverbank, the one behind their childhood home. As it had been all those years ago, the sunlight was pale and thin, filtering through summer leaves. Her 10-year-old self stood a few feet away, barefoot, holding a stick, laughing. Beside her was Lily, her younger sister, in the little blue dress, her blonde hair sticking to her face in the humidity. Mara wanted to move, to scream, to stop what she knew was coming, but her body wouldn't obey. She could only watch. "You can't hide forever." Lily giggled, darting toward the trees. Mara's younger self chased after her, the two of them vanishing through the reeds near the river's bend. The scene warped, light dimming. The laughter turned to shrieks, not of play, but of panic. Lily's foot had caught on a root. She'd stumbled into the river's edge. The current wasn't deep, but fast. Mara remembered now, the sharp sting of fear, the argument before it. How Lily had found the doll Mara had hidden and refused to give it back. The way Mara had shoved her, meaning only to scare her. The scream, the splashed eye, and the memory. Her younger self froze on the bank, torn between running for help and pretending it hadn't happened. The current swallowed Lily's small shape, pulling her dress beneath the surface. The water went still too quickly. No struggle, no sound, just the slow ripple of bubbles fading downstream. And then, silence. Tears streamed down Mara's face as the memory released her. The forest blurred, the sky darkened, and she was back in the small, impossible room. Only now, it was half flooded with murky water. The blue dress floated on the surface, spread out like a flower. Beneath it, something moved, the outline of a small body twisting slowly, hair fanning through the water. "I didn't mean to," Mara sobbed. "I was just a kid. I didn't know." The voice interrupted softly. "You buried me here, Mara. You and Mom and Dad. You promised not to tell." Her breath caught. That part she had forgotten, or forced herself to. The family silence. The years of pretending Lily had gone missing. The water kept rising, swirling around her legs. Cold hands brushed her knees, her waist, her throat. Please, she begged. I'm sorry. The blue dress rose again, lifting until it hovered inches from her face. Inside the folds, the dark sockets of Lily's eyes blinked open once more. Then remember me, the voice whispered. Remember everything. Mara screamed as the water surged over her head. For a brief moment, she felt herself dragged downward, her lungs filling with cold. But when she broke the surface again, she was no longer in the room. She was standing in her own bedroom, drenched, the floorboards beneath her feet dripping river water. The house was silent, but the whisper remained, soft and satisfied, echoing inside her mind. Now we're together again. Mara stood in the middle of her bedroom, soaked to the bone, her chest heaving. The air around her rippled faintly, as though the entire house were exhaling in slow rhythm. Water dripped from her hair and clothes, pooling on the warped floorboards. Everything smelled of wet earth and iron. She turned toward the mirror on her dresser, but her reflection wasn't wet. The woman staring back was dry, her hair neatly brushed, her eyes calm. And then, without moving her lips, the reflection whispered, "You shouldn't have remembered." The walls shuddered. Paint bubbled outward like blisters, and with every swell came the sound of breath, deep, slow, the inhale and exhale of something immense. The ceiling groaned as if under great weight. Mara stumbled back, her wet shoes slapping against the floor. From beneath her, faint vibrations rose, the rhythm of a heartbeat, steady and powerful. "Lily," she whispered, "please stop." But the name only seemed to stir the house further. From down the hallway, doors began to open and close by themselves, slamming with perfect cadence. 3 times. Always 3 does she try to run. The hallway stretched ahead of her, impossibly long, the floorboards warping like waves beneath her feet. Each step seemed to drag her deeper instead of forward. The photographs on the walls had returned, but they moved now, eyes tracking her, mouths twitching. In some frames, she saw herself as a child. In others, she saw Lily, wet and smiling. "You kept the secret," one whispered. "All this time." The air thickened until it hurt to breathe. Every inhale tasted of river water. Every exhale filled the air with whispers that weren't her own. When she reached the end of the hall, the house opened into a space that shouldn't have existed, vast, pulsing, alive. The floorboards beneath her feet rose and fell like the swell of lungs. The wallpaper was gone, replaced by living wood, slick with moisture, veins of dark sap running through it like blood. At the room's center stood the little girl in the blue dress, bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. She smiled, that same small, wrong smile, and said, "You can't leave. The house remembers. It remembers everything." Behind her, the walls expanded outward with a deep, hollow sigh. Mara felt the house drawing her in, her heartbeat sinking with its slow, monstrous rhythm. "You can't have me," she cried, backing away. But the floor tilted upward, dragging her toward the child. "You already gave yourself to me," Lily said softly. "The moment you remembered." The girl reached out her hand, small, pale, dripping with dark water, and placed it over Mara's heart. A surge of cold shot through her, sharp enough to steal her breath. The room dimmed, edges blurring. As her vision faded, she saw the walls closing in, folding like lungs around them both. Then, in the final second before blackness, Lily whispered, "Now it's your turn to stay." The morning came softly, as though nothing terrible had ever happened. Pale light spilled through the windows of the old farmhouse, illuminating floating dust motes and still air. Birds called faintly from somewhere far away, their song distant, detached. The house was silent. No breathing, no whispering, no heartbeat beneath the floor. Just silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm. In the upstairs bedroom, the bed was neatly made. The crowbar leaned against the wall where Mara had left it days before. There was no sign of her. Only damp footprints that led from the window to the cellar door and stopped. Later that week, a real estate agent drove up the long gravel road, frowning at the overgrown path and the sagging porch. The listing had been active for years, though no one ever seemed to finish the paperwork. The agent stepped out of her car, clutching her folder, and glanced up at the house. The place looked ordinary enough, quiet, lonely, a bit neglected. But the moment she crossed the threshold, she stopped short. The air inside was cold, carrying the faint scent of river water and lilac. The floors creaked under her heels, groaning as if unhappy to be disturbed. She moved through the rooms, taking notes, snapping photos. Everything looked staged, almost too neat. A child's blue ribbon rested on the kitchen table beside a single teacup, still half full of something dark and long-cooled. When she reached the hallway, she paused at a closed door she didn't remember seeing on the plans. It was small, painted an old dull green. She hesitated, then turned the knob. The door opened onto an empty room. Nothing inside but a little iron bed beneath the window and a faded blue dress folded carefully on the quilt. For a moment, she swore she heard soft humming, the faint, tuneless sound of a child at play. Then, silence again. Outside, the wind began to rise. It whispered through the trees that bordered the property, brushing against the windows in soft, rhythmic taps, 3 at a time. The agent shivered, closed her folder, and decided she'd come back tomorrow. She didn't notice the reflection in the window as she left. The shape of a woman standing behind the glass, her eyes dark and distant, a small hand resting on her shoulder. Nor did she see the faint ripples spreading across the floorboards, as though something beneath them was stirring again that night. As dusk fell over the farmhouse, the lights inside flickered on by themselves. For a moment, through the front window, the living room looked alive again, warm, glowing, filled with laughter. 2 figures sat side by side on the old couch, a woman and a little girl in a blue dress. They turned toward each other, smiling faintly, their hands clasped. The house sighed, settling into its foundations like a beast going back to sleep. Outside, the wind stilled. Inside, from somewhere deep under the floorboards, came a single soft whisper, gentle, almost loving, "Good night."